What's up, everybody? Welcome once again to Syracuse Football Postgame presented by Krause Health. My name is Brent Axe. We're live here on the Syracuse Football Orange Facebook page. We're live on YouTube and live on Twitter. We're following up a Syracuse loss in a bowl game, first time since 2004. We can say that has happened, although Syracuse has made bowl games kind of sporadically since then. But they did have a little bit of a winning streak going in bowl games. That ends tonight as Minnesota takes down Syracuse by a final score of 28-20 in the Pinstripe Bowl at Yankee Stadium. It felt like two Aaron Judge blasts, if you will, if you want to use a Yankee reference, in the third quarter of this game, sunk Syracuse's battleship, and it was at a time in the game when they really had momentum and looked like they were going to make this a game. 14-10 coming out. Syracuse kicks a field goal. Minnesota responds with a huge play. It was two big plays, as a matter of fact, that took down Syracuse. One was a pick six that Garrett Schrader threw in the third quarter. Schrader was all over the place in this game. We saw the good, bad, and the ugly from Garrett Schrader in this matchup here. A pick six in the third quarter, 70 yards the other way, untouched, and that gave Minnesota a lead, an 11-point lead at 21-10. Syracuse did fight back and get a field goal to make it a one-score game after that at 21-13, but a huge kickoff return for Minnesota, 82 yards. They capitalize a touchdown right after that. They go up 28-13 at that point. Syracuse does fight back for a touchdown in the fourth quarter. An onside kick does not go their way. They were set to get the ball. Now, they would have got the ball back with not a lot of time to go up the field, probably about 10 seconds or so. But the fact that Syracuse, the most penalized team in college football this year, commits a penalty that ends their season was fitting. It was poetic in a way. Elijah Clark draws a penalty, which ESPN did not show a replay on, by the way. Bad job by them. Wes Durham and Roddy Jones, they did a terrific job, not blaming the broadcast crew for that. Where was the director? Where's the technical people on that? You got to show a replay of something that big. They did not, but Clark did commit a penalty, and Minnesota was able to run the clock out here. So Syracuse is going to finish the season at 7-6. So your thoughts on this game itself, and now a season complete for Syracuse. As Doug notes here, fitting that a 15-yard penalty ended the season for Syracuse undisciplined right until the end. Merritt saying that number 5 needs to go to the transfer portal, had a chance to tie the game and gets an unsportsmanlike penalty. Incredible. Now, it would have been a really difficult thing for Syracuse to go up the field and convert a 2-point conversion, but you can't just throw that opportunity away with a stupid penalty like that. Williams says, I thought on fourth down in the first half, they should have gone for it. A couple of chances there for Syracuse. A punt at the end of the first half, I thought was going to burn them as well. They get the ball, they drive right up the field, they kind of wipe away what was a situation where Syracuse should not have punted, should have gone for it, but there were other opportunities on fourth down, as William noted, that they probably could have done that as well. So keep your comments coming in here, guys, as our friend Steve jumps in to say, we didn't lose for any of the reasons we were supposed to lose. We found other ways to do it. Steve with a great point there. Minnesota with that terrific running game, physical defense. They actually had to go back to their starting quarterback as their starter who had taken over late in the season because of an injury to Tanner Morgan got hurt. And Steve with a great point there. And here's one of the reasons that I did not see coming that Syracuse would lose this game. Look at these numbers. Syracuse outgains Minnesota 484-215. Minnesota only ran for 77 yards in this game. We heard all about the vaunted running game from Mo Ibrahim, who finishes with 71 yards on 16 carries, but nowhere near the time of possession that Minnesota usually racks up. Minnesota only allows opponents to run 57 plays. That was one of the top marks in the country. Syracuse ran 86 plays. So, Steve, with the astute observation there, everything that Syracuse was not supposed to do in this game, they did. We mentioned Schrader was all over the place, 32 of 51, 330 yards. He did not throw a touchdown, threw the pick six. As we mentioned, another interception was wiped away by a penalty. I like the game that LaQuinn Allen played, kind of taking the baton from Sean Tucker into next year. 15 carries, 94 yards, including a 29-yard spurt. Schrader did have 15 carries for 45 yards, couple of touchdowns for him, including the fourth quarter touchdown we mentioned on fourth down where he ran for about 50 yards before he even got into the end zone. Allen 11 catches, 60 yards. Devon Cooper goes out with a bang for Syracuse in his last game, 114 yards receiving. On the day, Arondé Gatson with 7 catches for 78 yards. Damian Alford with 3 catches for 57, though he dropped the big one in the fourth quarter for Syracuse. That could have been a huge play there. So we mentioned 2 quarterbacks get in for Minnesota. Kellen McCannis went out with a lower body injury in the first half. Tanner Morgan comes in, throws an absolute beauty of a touchdown pass to Jackson, but finishes just 4 of 7 for 58 yards and 2 touchdowns, 11 of 16, 138 overall for 2 quarterbacks. So Syracuse piled up a ton of yards, but not a ton of points and opportunities, as those 2 third quarter plays were just killer for Syracuse. Minnesota with 2 touchdowns in the second quarter, 2 touchdowns in the third quarter. They don't even score in the fourth and ultimately win 28-20. So Syracuse was 7 of 16 on third down. They had 27 first downs to Minnesota's 14. Again, you look at the numbers and they're heavily tilted towards the orange here, but the big numbers for Minnesota came in the third quarter with those 2 big plays. They were a little more disciplined than Syracuse. Minnesota with just 2 penalties on the day for 20 yards. We could haggle about a couple pass interference calls that Syracuse should have got, but ultimately, we kind of went over the reasons that Syracuse lost this game, but not for the reasons that you would think they lost this game. So Stephen with a great point there. Let's continue to look at some of your comments here coming in here, highlight those and what you guys think of this loss. And it's also a recap of the season itself. So Syracuse does finish with a winning record. They start the year 6-0. They lose 5 in a row with the opportunity to lose the 6th in a row against Boston College, win that game to get to 7-5, but finish this season at 7-6. As James notes here, undisciplined, very disheartening all year long. Dale says, what a shame to lose, wasting a good effort because of turnovers. William brought this up too, and I'm glad you did. Forgot to mention that, man, that field was in horrible shape at Yankee Stadium. The irony that that game was sponsored by the Bad Boy Mowers, right? It was sponsored by a lawn care company, and that turf could not be in worse shape. You just saw chunks of the field everywhere. This tends to happen when you put these football fields, these temporary fields in baseball stadiums. The Fenway Bowl field was in terrible shape. There was a game last night in San Diego that I believe was at a baseball stadium. That was in terrible shape as well. So the last 2 games, it wasn't much of an issue because the ground was so frozen. But temperatures were in the near 50 at kickoff, and, they didn't play that long in the dark or the cold temperatures. So the ground got dug up. Players were slipping everywhere in this game. Turf was in just awful shape at Yankee Stadium. Kevin noting that the offensive line continues to cost us the game. They had a 3-man front and still got pressure. Any other quarterback would have 6 sacks on him. Schrader did the best that he could in that situation. A couple more of your comments here. Keep them coming. James says, honest question, is this Schrader's ceiling or is there still room for improvement for next year? Look, he made some big leaps this year, James. Jason Beck brought his completion percentage up from like 52 to 65%. Beck now takes over as the offensive coordinator. These two have a great relationship. Schrader was very excited about some things about the offense next year. But you didn't have Sean Tucker in this game. You didn't have Matthew Bergeron in this game, right? Some players opting out. That was another huge storyline of this game. Minnesota's All-American center opts out. We mentioned Tucker out, Bergeron out, Mikal Jones. He announced his intention to go into the NFL draft this week, but we thought he was playing in this game, but he comes out in pregame warmups in civvies. I don't blame him for not playing with that awful turf out there. You don't want to slip and tear an ACL and have your NFL draft chances in jeopardy there. Garrett Williams already experienced that earlier this year. I still think he's going to get drafted despite the injury that he suffered, but I understand it. It's just disappointing that, the business of college football means more than the game, and we don't get to see the very best of the best in a game like this. Again, I completely understand the decisions, but it's kind of expected that some of the best players in the game won't play. Mo Ibrahim did play. That guy's going to be an NFL running back, and a couple other players that are going to get drafted on the Minnesota side did end up playing in this game. It's a personal choice. You're risking injury every game, but in particular, you don't want your NFL career to be, shattered or at least put in jeopardy in what amounts to an exhibition game. So, that's an interesting debate as always in the world of college football, the continuing and crazy world of college football at this point. Transfer portal opt-outs, coaching movement in the offseason in the case of Syracuse, and what was a turbulent offseason from the time they walked off the field against Boston College with a win right up till now. And we'll see what the rest of the offseason brings. There's a second wave of the transfer portal. There's still another signing day to come. Syracuse lost, remember, Lenore Sellers at the last minute. The quarterback ends up signing with South Carolina. That's a big loss. Now, Syracuse's quarterback room has Schrader. It has Carlos Del Rio Wilson. It is Justin Lamson returning. There's some true competition there. I think it's Schrader's job still to lose, but if Del Rio Wilson can make some gains, or even Lamson can make some gains coming off of an injury and not the opportunity to play this year, I think you keep an open mind. Schrader's job to lose, his job, but don't just discount a Del Rio Wilson or even a Lamson maybe overtaking him at this point. Greg says they came out and played with emotion and intensity. There were mistakes, but to all things considered, Dale saying the defensive line about 80 pounds underweight per person to their offensive line. It was, but it really ultimately didn't end up mattering, right? Because the yards were gained, the opportunities were there. It was just those big plays in the third quarter that really had a big effect on this game. As Steve notes here, Minnesota last in the country in tackles for loss, yet they were second in points given up. That changed to a pass rush team to turn this thing around. It was interesting with Nick Monroe running the defense today. Syracuse hired Rocky Long to continue the 3-3-5 approach, but it was Nick Monroe running the defense today. And he actually went to a 4-2-5 look at times, mixed some things around, had to put more people up front to slow down Ibrahim, to slow down that power running game for Minnesota. That actually kind of worked. And I'll tell you what, there was a pretty impressive debut. We talked about LaQuinn Allen kind of taking the baton. A lot of young players were going to get the opportunity in this game. I want to look up his numbers while we're talking about it here. I was really impressed by Caden Bailey, the linebacker, the freshman for Syracuse. He's actually the nephew of Champ Bailey, the Pro Football Hall of Famer. Had 6 tackles on the day, a tackle for loss, an impressive sack in the first half of this game. And not only were you missing Mikel Jones, Anwar Sparrow couldn't come out there. So you had, of course, Marlo Wax intact. You had Bailey come in at linebacker, and a lot of younger players, next man up, as they like to say, that had to elevate in this game and take over for players that were either injured or, for the most part, opting out. Kevin saying Allen actually fits this offense better hands, and more of a burst. Steven agrees that Allen looked ready to move in for Tucker, 154 yards on 26 catches. Look, Allen really showed some things down the stretch. They started to use him more, maybe in anticipation of the bowl game and taking over for Tucker. They probably figured Tucker was not going to play in this game. I love what he does out of the backfield. He had a couple of big bursts in this game, the biggest being 29 yards on the day. Look, Tucker has big shoes to fill, but it's promising what LaQuinn Allen showed at that position, especially because Syracuse has kind of gotten away from the multi-back look. They've really been sticking with one guy in this case, when Tucker kind of changed that in previous years in the Dino Babers era. They would go with multiple backs, and think of when Syracuse played Florida State, when they played Notre Dame, and a couple of teams this year that used 2 or 3 backs, and how that wore down a defense. That's not what Syracuse does. Not to say somebody can't emerge to change Dino's mind and change Jason Beck's mind there, but I really liked what I saw from LaQuinn Allen today on that front. James says, any news on why Deuce and Jihad Carter hit the portal? Everybody's got their individual motivations there. I have not heard news on either one of those two at this point. Deuce did not get picked up right away. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. I haven't seen anybody pick up Deuce Chestnut. I might have missed it in the past few days here, but everybody's got their own motivations and their options to go. He's still got a few years left in his career. I don't understand that one from the standpoint of, Deuce is somebody who, if he stayed at Syracuse, is going to go to the National Football League. It's not like he's going to hurt his chances there. I think his stock dropped a little bit this year, but is still an NFL caliber player that a lot of people would like. I don't think he was happy with the transition from Tony White at defensive coordinator. He put some things on social media right after that move that indicated he wasn't happy about it. So, until we get a chance to talk to those guys and really get an understanding of why they moved on, I would imagine the Tony White move had something to do with that, but they're sticking with the 3-3-5. They're bringing in a great coordinator. Nick Monroe is very popular on that staff. They kept him around, not as defensive coordinator. He served as that today, but he'll go back to his secondary and recruiting role with Rocky Long taking over after this. But it's a good question. You never know, really, what the individual motivations of these guys are. More playing time, different system. Some guys feel they could stand out more at schools, but Deuce's, it was a questionable one considering he stands out, NFL caliber talent, starter. Like, you think you have everything you want at a place like Syracuse, but maybe he thinks he can take his talents to an upgrade, if you will, in his mind at this point. Dennis jumps in to say, I really think Syracuse will be better, D linemen especially. The young one's doing good. Let's see. Cody says number 5 can play through a little too much emotion. Syracuse had 6 penalties in this game. Look, they were the most penalized team in college football this year, and they've got to cut back on that. To see Clark get that penalty at the end, which again, they didn't show a replay of, which is very frustrating. He did do it. I mean, it's not like we're missing something that didn't happen. He clearly did it, got the call. Stupid play, can't do it. You can't let your emotions get the better of you in that situation, particularly when you're going to get the ball back, right? Now, they were going to get the ball back with not a lot of time on the clock, no timeouts. You need a miracle at that spot, but you can't have that wiped away by a penalty. So it was actually kind of poetic that Syracuse's season ended on a penalty when they were the most penalized team in college football. And that was a very consistent problem for this team all year long. So that is certainly priority one in spring ball and through the offseason is you've got to teach these guys to cut back on these penalties. That could be, essentially being the victim of a young team at times. But this veteran players, I don't want to pick on anybody, but Carlos Vettorello, consistently throughout the season was committing penalties. We had a couple more in this game, right? So there's just certain players that were more vulnerable to that. Veteran, young guys, everything in between. This team committed penalties on offense, defense, and special teams. So, I think special teams was a lot better this year. They cleaned up a lot of things with Bob Ligashevsky and his full-time focus on special teams. That is priority one. Obviously, you got to get another quarterback in the recruiting cycle, losing a guy like Lenora Sellers, which, by the way, that was a little, how can I put this? It was a little questionable, right? Now, I know he wanted to stay home, and I never want to doubt the motivations of, a 17, 18-year-old kid. But South Carolina didn't even recruit Sellers until like a month ago, right? And I think they were basically shamed into recruiting him because you had a lot of fans in South Carolina saying, how can this guy have this kind of all-state season, one of the best quarterbacks in the state, and you're not even recruiting him, right? Syracuse was on him years ago. Jason Beck was recruiting Lenora Sellers when Beck was at Virginia, comes to Syracuse, gets the commitment, sticks with him, by the way, through an injury. Sellers had a bad injury in his junior year, which would cause a lot of schools to flee the other way. Beck sticks with him. Syracuse stays with him the whole way. And, South Carolina swoops in and I think offers him a lot of things that he won't be able to capitalize on, frankly. That's a loaded quarterback room at South Carolina. Sellers would be coming to a quarterback room that's full at Syracuse, but certainly would have every opportunity to be the starting quarterback in 2024 at the very least, right? So, look, that stung one way or the other. Syracuse lost him. They couldn't hold on to him. The second signing day, if you will, is coming up in February, and we'll see what kind of gains they can make there. And now that they can put their full focus on the transfer portal as well. Steve notes here, the end of Andre Schmidt's great career. We'll have to find both a place kicker and a punter. You have Max, hate to say it, not the answer. I like that they tried something different. They brought in the kid, Australian rules football, something different, but not doing it, not consistent enough, too many shanks, too much inconsistency. We've gotten spoiled here at Syracuse by great punters that flip the field, and special teams is something that matters here. So replacing both a place kicker like that and a punter, special teams is going to be a big focus in the offseason and recruiting and, in the transfer portal, frankly. And Syracuse did bring in a punter through the transfer portal. So maybe that'll solve their problem. You get some experience in there from a big program. They picked up a cornerback from Notre Dame, a cornerback from Nebraska to come in. So they're getting some players that were, big enough and good enough for bigger programs to transfer in. But certainly the job is not done there. Tom thinks that Sellers will end up in the transfer portal anyway, discovering that he won't be playing much at South Carolina. Al says game-ending penalty was a joke. Overall, Syracuse played a fairly clean game. Number 57 committed 2 of the penalties. We mentioned that with Vettorello having the struggles that he is. Al adds this, that Carlos Del Rio Wilson, a Florida 4-star, not worried about the quarterback position. Don't forget Lawson as well. Justin Lamson, who had a great spring game. And I know it's a spring game, but he aired it out, showed that Syracuse had somebody that could sling it in there. Unfortunately, got hurt. There's going to be true competition in the room in the spring. And I think that's all you can ask for, right? A couple of good quarterbacks. The backup quarterback always plays at Syracuse by injury or performance. That's been the case every year since 2012. Ryan Nassib being the last quarterback that went the distance for the Orange. So they have competition in that room, and that's good news there. You know, all the players that played, not today necessarily, but have played their last games at Syracuse, Tucker, Bergeron, Mikel Jones, Garrett Williams. This is going to be a fruitful NFL draft for Syracuse. I think they could have upwards of 5 players selected. That's obviously good news. The more you see Syracuse's name on the screen at the NFL draft, particularly if you have a couple of guys that go on day 1 or day 1 or day 2, pardon me. Bergeron might be a first-round pick. I don't know if I would predict that at that point, but he got a Senior Bowl invite. He's got every opportunity to impress. And the more draft picks you can get, the more exposure out there you can get. Listen, Syracuse is, there's been years where the only guy getting drafted is the punter, right? So to have 4 or 5 guys get picked in this upcoming draft is going to be huge for Syracuse. And, you got to get that out there. And a good problem to have, right? Good problem to have when you have a number of guys opting out of a bowl game because they're good enough for the National Football League and have to weigh that career decision at this point. That is a problem you want to have year in and year out, right? Going to bowl games and having 4 or 5 players good enough in those bowl games saying, maybe I shouldn't play in this thing because it could affect my NFL career. That is certainly a good problem to have at this point. Let's see here. Couple more questions from you guys. James saying, who will be the new face that will have a big impact next year? Great question. I think LaQuinn Allen really had a breakout game today. I think Schrader can improve on what he's doing. I think there's still a lot of talent in that wide receiver room. I mean, Arondé Gatson is a star at this point, emerged as a star. Whether you think he's a tight end or not, I think he kind of outgrew that position. He's just kind of in that flex position. That is, somebody who's going to be first team all ACC to start the year. We mentioned Bailey had a great game today. Dennis is mentioning a couple of players here on the defensive line that could stand out, right? Moving in there. Al likes LaQuint, looked great. Beck used him more than a Nye would have at this point. Joe agrees, saying that LaQuint's the real deal. Passes the look test. Sharp out of the passing game. Certainly had some bursts, saw the whole 29-yard run. He had an 18-yard run in this game, couple of big runs there. So, like we said, Tucker's going to have big, big shoes to fill. But LaQuinn Allen shows he's at least got the talent to go out there and carry that number 1 spot. I'm probably forgetting a couple of guys off the top of my head, but it's going to be an interesting transition because you have an established quarterback coming back, established running back, talented receiver. The offensive line is going to need to be shook up a little bit with Bergeron moving on, and who can you insert there? Linebacker position, Marlowe Wax is the big star returning. Defensive line has to continue to develop players, and I think there's a lot of emerging talent there, but nobody that I would really, label an up-and-coming star at this point. Could be wrong on that, but nobody that really pops at this point. Caleb Okechukwu returns, obviously. Cornerback's going to be an interesting position with the opportunities opening up there with Deuce moving on. We mentioned the corners they brought in from the transfer portal that could stabilize things there. Punter and kicker, a huge need for the Orange next year. So we'll keep an eye on it. Spring ball right around the corner at this point. Let's see. Just catching up on you guys here. As Katie notes, they're getting drafted when they weren't necessarily 5-star players coming in. Going back to the draft discussion, that's a great point there. Dennis noting that Syracuse lost a good receiver against Purdue that could have helped a lot. Injuries were just a big storyline this year. I mentioned DeMarcus Adams. He's shown some big play potential out there. Unfortunately, Adams had a horse collar tackle on a fumble return for Minnesota, which ended up not mattering because they had 12 players on the field. But there's a guy that's shown some breakout opportunities. And that's it. We're starting to think about next year. We're starting to think about 2023, what Syracuse football looks like in 2023. I think it's interesting that, I asked John Wildhack this flat out. We had a chat right here on syracuse.com on some of these channels you're watching right now in early December. And I asked John about, Dino Babers' contract status. Well, it hasn't been made public. We're pretty much under the understanding that he signed through the 2024 season. John said that as long as the program keeps improving, Dino will keep coaching here. We're at that kind of crossroads of, do you give Dino a second contract extension? Does a bowl bid, does a 7-6 season earn a contract extension at this point? What has to be shown next year to earn that? Just another bowl game? Because I think, this is a program at this point where a 7-6, 8-5 season is kind of the best of what you're going to get. Once a decade or so, you can pop and win 10 games. But given where this program is now, remember the ACC schedule changes next year. It's no longer the Atlantic and the Coastal Division. Thankfully, by the way, I'm glad that they changed the scheduling model. You're still trying to top Clemson. You're still trying to top, those teams that you're chasing in the ACC. You're just going to see more of the league every few years, right? So that changes your approach in recruiting and everything, because you're just basically seeing everybody in the ACC in a 3-4 year cycle. So there's a lot of questions going into 2023 at this point, but I think you got to be feeling better about some things, particularly with the players that'll be going in the draft and some rooms that are a little more stocked at this point than last year. There's always transition. There's always new opportunities. But look, the portal, name, image, and likeness, and the way that college sports is today, it, at the very least on paper, gives you the opportunity to go grab some players and compete right away. Is Syracuse doing what it needs to do to compete in those areas? I'm not going to answer that question right here, right now, but in some ways they are, in some ways they aren't, right? They're still at a disadvantage in a lot of ways. Remember, the John Laley complex is being built. Art and Chandler Jones made a major donation. A couple of other former players made major donations. Syracuse trying to keep up in the arms race facility-wise. You're not going to match what, Alabama, Clemson, and Florida have, but, even what some of the best programs in the ACC have at this point. Feels like they're constantly a step or two behind in that department. But, on the good front, you're talking about a program that went to a bowl game, and we weren't having this discussion last year. We weren't doing this post-game show last year because they fell that short of a bowl game, and they took that momentum. They took the competitiveness they showed. Lost a lot of close games last year. Nobody's excusing that, but got the 1 or 2 more wins they needed. Maybe not in the fashion people would like to see it happen, starting 6-0, finishing now 1-6 on the season, 1-5 to finish the regular season, tack on the bowl loss. So a lot to think about going into next season, right? And what this team can be and what they need to do to remain in that conversation. Look at the quarterbacks that transferred out of the ACC. Dennis Leary out. Sam Hartman transfers out. He's probably going to end up at Notre Dame. So you got to think about that and what the ACC and the landscape of the league is going to look like next year. Non-conference wise, Syracuse, off the top of my head, I know they start with Colgate. They play Western Michigan at home. They go to Purdue, and then they play Army, which is never an easy game. It's an interesting non-conference slate, certainly not a murderer's row like we saw this year. And Syracuse got through that. That schedule was tough on paper to start the year, but having 5 of your first 6 at home, they started 6-0, so they passed that test, right? So let's see, it's late December. Schedule should be out by early February, and we'll start to get a sense of what the 2023 season will look like in that way, what recruiting continues to be, more players out of the portal. If Syracuse loses any more players out of the portal, it never stops, folks, and we'll be right here to cover it all for you. And I think we'll end the show there for tonight. Couple of programming notes, though, before we do. First of all, thank you. Thanks to all of our great football fans that came by all season long after the games. We got a lot of late night games for, those of us on the East Coast, but hey, we do this on the internet and people are watching from all over the place, and time doesn't matter in some cases, and always love to see some of the same faces here in the chat throughout the season. So thank you for coming by and being a part of that. We do this for basketball too, over on the Syracuse Orange basketball Facebook page, on YouTube, on Twitter as well. A lot of you in the chat, I know, cross over and do both sports. So just a reminder for those of you that don't know, we do this for basketball. We will not be doing it for the Boston College game on New Year's Eve, just so you guys know. I have that night off, but Once we get into consistent ACC play starting January 3rd against Louisville, we'll be here pretty much every game doing the post-game show, but we will not be doing a show Saturday on New Year's Eve, just so you guys know. But after that, we'll pretty much be here game in and game out. So now we kind of make that transition into basketball. Don't forget about lacrosse starting up in a couple weeks as well. And the 2022 Syracuse football season is a wrap at 7-6 following a 28-20 loss in the Pinstripe Bowl to Minnesota. Happy New Year, everybody. Want to mention that. Glad that you got that in there before we closed out for the night here. Yes, Steve, they actually give me a night off once in a while. How about that, right? But listen, Happy New Year. Thank you. Appreciate the support throughout the football season. But now we just turn the page to basketball and keep the conversation rolling. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week, the rest of your year, right? Just a couple of days left here in 2022, and we'll see you in 2023. This has been Syracuse Football Postgame presented by Krause Health. Syracuse falls to Minnesota in the Pinstripe Bowl, final score 28-20. Thanks, everybody.